All right. It's time to get started. Are you all ready for some climate science on tap? That was pretty good. Let's try one more time. Are y'all ready for some climate science on tap? So much better that time. You guys are professionals. So, we're doing something a little bit differently tonight. We've had a little technical difficulty with the projector. So we're going back to the way back days when people used to actually just get up and talk. And so our panelists today, they're going to come up, they're going to introduce themselves, they're going to tell you a little bit about their work, and then we're going to get right into the Q&A. So, first of all, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Sean McDonald. I'm a lecturer in the program on the environment at the University of Washington and also a research scientist there. And along with Cascadia Climate Action, we've been putting together these climate science on tap events for quite some time now. We're doing them quarterly, and this is the very last climate science on tap of 2019. Oh, that's sad, right? But don't worry, in 2020, we will be back with 4 more climate science on taps. So tonight's event is all about crops, carbon, and climate change. We're really going to be focusing on regenerative farming and smart agriculture policy that can help us fight climate change. I just want to go ahead and give a quick shout out to our panelists. I'll introduce them each one by one, but let's go ahead and give them a round of applause first. We've got geologist and author David Montgomery here tonight. We've got policy advisor Greg Rock here tonight as well. And farmer and instructor Aaron Varadi is here as well. So let's give them all a big round of applause. We also have some great organizations tabling. I'm going to ask our organizations to raise their hands when I call them out. We've got Audubon Washington in the house. They're over there in the corner. We've got Carbon Washington in the house. They're over there as well. We've got Seattle Neighborhood Farmers Market in the house. They're over there in the corner. We've got Nori in the house. We've got Tilth Alliance in the house. Over there in that corner. And last but not least, we have Cascadia Climate Action in the house. I'll tell you a little bit more about all these organizations a little bit later, but I do want to get started with our program. Now remember, you're going to have to just visualize the great graphics that our panelists put together. They're going to tell you their stories, and you'll just have to visualize it because we have no slides tonight. So I'll just go ahead and introduce our very first panelist, David R. Montgomery. He's a MacArthur Fellow and Professor of Geomorphology at the University of Washington. He's an internationally recognized geologist who studies landscape evolution and the effects of geological processes on ecological systems and human societies. An author of award-winning popular science books, he has been featured in documentary films, network and cable news, and on a wide variety of TV and radio programs, including Nova, PBS NewsHour, All Things Considered, and the president's favorite, Fox and Friends. His books have been translated into 9 languages, and he has some of them over there for you to purchase tonight if you'd like. Before I turn the microphone over to David, I do want to point out that you all have 3x5 cards sitting in front of you. If you have questions for any of our panelists, please take the time to write them down. Our volunteers will collect them, and we will integrate your questions into the Q&A. So please, if you have a question, write it down on the card, and we'll collect these before we start the Q&A. All right. So without further ado, David R. Montgomery. Let's give it up for David.
Ooh, Sean, thank you. Yeah, if you want to see a really weird interview, go watch the YouTube clip of the Fox and Friends one. Listen to what I say. Watch what the Chiron, the little streaming thing at the bottom says. Complete disconnect. It was really fun. I don't think they knew actually who they had invited on. But anyway, it's my job tonight to try and set the stage a little bit for looking at regenerative farming as a way to pull carbon from the atmosphere and put it back in the ground. There's lots of other reasons to engage in regenerative farming, but that's the appropriate one for Climate on Tap. I got into this as a geologist by basically looking at the other side, the degradation of land, and how societies throughout history had essentially pulled carbon from their soil and put it in the atmosphere. This is a process that started thousands of years ago with the dawn of agriculture, with the way that we've conventionally farmed. It turns out the villain of the first book that I wrote on soils, which was called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilization, the villain in that book was the plow. Because what does a plow do? By turning the surface of the earth over and oxidizing it, it accelerates microbial breakdown of organic matter. That's dead stuff, rotting things. What makes healthy, fertile soil? It's the combination of mineral matter and once living things and the living things, bacteria and fungi and worms and all those other things that all you gardeners know about. If you plow the land too often for too long, you burn through that organic matter and the fertility goes down. This is one of the reasons why the modern era of chemical-intensive fertilizer use was so attractive at the start of the 20th century, because the Western world had already degraded their land. That's what I wrote about in the Dirt book. And the basic bottom line of that book is that we've burned through roughly about 50%, that's a half, of the soil organic matter that we had in America's farmland at the time that Europeans arrived in North America. Globally, it's about the same. We've burned about half of the organic matter out of our agricultural soils. We've just done it at different paces in different parts of the world. But if you add all that carbon up, about a third of the amount of carbon that's been added to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution came from plowing up the Great Plains, plowing up the steppes of Russia, plowing up parts of Central Asia. We could actually put at least that much carbon, and actually a lot more, it turns out, back in the ground if we change the way that we farm. And if you want to go look at places where you can see this, you can go to farms all around the country and see that the organic matter content's down around 1% to 2%, when the native amount was more like 4 or 5%. So how can we actually turn that around? I actually started to learn that lesson in a very different place, and that is in my yard in North Seattle. Ann and I live up in Green Lake, Wallingford, depending on who you ask about what neighborhood it is. But we bought a place that had very dead soil. It was basically dirt. When we took our old growth lawn off and tried to actually plant a garden, we didn't find any worms, no life in the soil. We had soil about the color of these tabletops. It's now about the color of my jacket. That difference is carbon put back in the ground. We took it from about 1% organic matter up to almost 10% in a little over a decade, and it was all about the way that we gardened. And if you actually run the numbers, that's putting tons of carbon in the soil in our yard. Now, it's not going to stay there forever, right? That's one of the things about soil carbon. It moves. You have to keep gardening the way that builds soil organic matter to keep it there. But we've gone from being a net importer of organic matter, where we're getting compost and mulch from our neighbors, the Seattle Zoo, coffee shops, breweries, wherever we could get it. We now grow so much organic matter that we don't need it to mulch everything, and we're exporting it. So we've become a carbon sink in our yard. And I got real interested in whether or not you could do the same kind of thing on farms, and that basically formed the basis of the book I wrote most recently, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life. And what I did is I basically went around the world to interview farmers who had already restored their soil, had taken it from low organic matter to high organic matter. And in doing so, they had been able to reduce their fertilizer use by 50 to 90%. They'd reduce their pesticide use by 50 to 90%. They'd cut their diesel bill in half by at least. What are the three biggest expenditures on a modern agrochemical farm? Fertilizer, pesticide, and diesel. What are three of the biggest environmental footprints of a modern agrochemical farm? Fertilizer, pesticides, and diesel. If we could actually decrease that use, that's a benefit in and of itself. But those farmers who had adopted practices that were in line with the three principles of conservation agriculture: minimal tillage, keeping cover crops in the ground at all times, and planting a diversity of crops, not planting one or two crops, but growing a diverse community of life. That's a recipe for building soil organic matter by supporting the life in the soil. And the farmers I visited who had done all three also raised their soil organic matter content dramatically in a really short period of time. Now, I'm a geologist, so a short period of time is a decade or two to me. But it took societies around the world centuries to destroy their land in the past. We can actually fix it in decades. That's where the sort of reason for optimism and for talking about carbon farming as a legitimate way to put carbon in the soil. really sort of is rooted from and comes from. And if you run the numbers in terms of how much carbon we could pull out of the atmosphere by changing agriculture globally to these conservation agricultural practices, they're all over the map. It depends on what assumptions you make, who you talk to, what they're willing to assume, how much land you actually can convert. But at the reasonable high end of those estimates, you can basically argue that through a combination of forestry practices and agricultural practices, we could probably pull out about as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we've added since the Industrial Revolution if we did it on all our land everywhere, all our ag and forest land everywhere. That's a high lift. I don't think we can pull the whole thing off, but the point is, they're big numbers. We can reduce our environmental footprint of farming and probably grow more nutritious food while we're at it. That's the book Ann and I are working on now, to looking at whether or not regenerative agriculture grows food that's actually more nutritious for people. Why you should care about where your food is grown. In the words of the farmer's market booth over there, why you shouldn't take food from strangers. You should know how your food is grown. It turns out that if you're really looking at the full carbon budget of whether a plant-based diet or eating meat, the most important question to ask is, how is the cattle raised? Not whether you're eating beef, but how is the cattle raised? Not whether you're eating corn and soy, but how that was raised. Those are the questions that are at the heart of thinking about reframing the conversation about agriculture. But it's basically my job to basically illustrate that the idea of putting carbon back into the ground is one where it's solidly backed up by the experience of farmers around the world. There's good science involved in it as well. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in it, but the biggest lift on it is trying to incentivize and encourage farmers to participate in it. The good news is that it's more profitable for farmers to do regenerative farming than conventional farming, and that's why it's starting to take off in the Midwest. I never imagined, as a professor from Seattle, that I would be invited to talk at farming communities around the Midwest, but that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years, almost nonstop, is talking about the promise and potential of regenerative agriculture. And I see the biggest support for it from two communities, the climate community, like you all, and the farming community. We have a real opportunity for an alliance there between two groups of society that don't tend to see things terribly similarly, because whether you're trying to reduce on-farm costs and promote farm profitability, or you're trying to pull carbon from the atmosphere, the recipe is to put carbon in the ground to do it, because that's how you build fertile soils. So I'm probably have consumed about what my allotted amount of time will be. We're going to do a Q&A after we get through the three of us speaking. I brought copies of a couple of the ag-related books that I was just talking about. The Tilth booth has them over there if you want to pick up copies. Obviously, I encourage you to do so. And Sean, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, David. You painted such a vivid picture. I didn't even need the slides. So vivid. All right, and like David mentioned, you have the opportunity to ask questions during our Q&A. Please use those 3x5 cards to write down your questions for our panelists, and we'll get to those in just a few minutes. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next panelist. Aaron Varadi is the Program and Farm Manager and Field Instructor at the Organic Farm School on Whidbey Island, where he and a yearly class of farm managers in training produce vegetables, pastured meat, grains, and vegetable seed crops for farmers markets, farm stands, grocery store accounts, and seed companies. Organic Farm School has been trialing and incorporating a range of reduced tillage techniques for the past several years, both with research institutions and independently, in an effort to sequester soil carbon and increase soil health. And so Aaron's going to tell us a little bit about their efforts up on Whidbey Island from a real practitioner's standpoint. So let's welcome Aaron up front to tell us all about it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Maybe the biggest crowd I've ever spoken to. Got to admit, I'm a little nervous, but like this, how's that? Okay. So I grow vegetables mostly, so I'm going to speak to that. Thanks. Experience. It seems like no-till, reduced tillage has come a lot further, a lot faster in the grain and legume large-scale field, and I can speak to that a little bit more later. But for vegetables, these crops we grow, they have evolved in systems that really discourage any competition. So like weeds, mulch. A lot of these crops we grow, they need, or they very much prefer a clean seed bed, no competition. So hence the tillage. We know tillage is bad. Why? It's because we're trying to prepare a seed bed so our crops can grow. So on probably this year, about 75% of our farm, we're doing fairly standard tillage that is pretty in line with a lot of the organic vegetable farms in the region. I had some exquisite photos of all of our equipment, but I will try to paint you a word picture. Basically, you're just trying to turn the whole field brown, like you're trying to incorporate the copious amounts of cover crops that we do grow. Cover crop is my favorite crop. You could generate tons of biomass per acre, grow it yourself, and then incorporate it, terminate it. You got to kill that stuff. How do you kill that stuff? You usually sometimes plow it. We usually don't. There's a disc harrow, other pieces of equipment. And I will say, even though we're not where we should be at yet, we have been taking soil samples every year. And even with that regimen, we are increasing our soil organic matter by about 0.4% every year in the last 3 years since we've been on the site. So that is one way you can increase organic matter, but it'd be great if we could do it faster. So we have been tinkering with a couple different reduced tillage methods, both in-house and in partnership with Washington State University. So I'll talk about the WSU trial first, and that was a trial in strip tillage. I believe there's a very fine publication online you could find about that. But the general idea is instead of turning the whole field brown back to dirt, you grow a very tall cover crop, as high as you can get it, and then you flail mow that, or sometimes you can use another piece of equipment called a roller crimper. Anyway, you kill that cover crop, lay it down as mulch, so you got all the benefits of a mulch on the soil, which sometimes is also a detriment depending on the crop. So you got the mulch. Instead of tilling it all in, you just do strips. Like you till strips where your rows of squash or broccoli are going to go. And so we trialed that out with WSU, Doug Collins, the researcher there, for a couple of years with winter squash and broccoli. Pretty promising results. You got to pick your crops right. Not all crops are going to respond well to that system, but you kind of got to pick and choose what works best for each crop. And another system we're trialing now, just started to, instead of reduced tillage by, let's say, like square footage, it's reduced tillage by cubic foot, let's say. So instead of tilling really deep all the way across the field like regular tillage would be, and instead of tilling just in strips pretty deep, this new system would be a shallower form of tillage. So ideally only disturbing the soil down to 2 to 4 inches. This system has been popularized by a Quebecois fellow, GMorphologist, the Market Gardener. Maybe you've all read it. He's Instagram celebrity right now. But the idea with that is you form permanent raised beds, apply a lot of organic matter, so compost, manure, cover crops if you can get your systems down right. And then instead of tilling very deeply, you're using a tool that's called a power harrow. It's basically an egg beater. So you just go very shallow because, again, plants like a pretty clean seed bed. You need to incorporate your amendments somehow as well. And so we're trialing that this next year for the first time too. And basically, like the take-home message, I think, for vegetables in a reduced tillage system right now is that there's still a lot of work to be done. And there's a lot of equipment that needs to be developed to fit these systems, which I think ties really well into what our next presenter is going to say. Like, there's ways to do this out there. We're all pretty smart. We could figure it out. We just need the tools to do it. And I think we're getting there. So I will end it there. Can answer more of the nitty-gritty questions later. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Yeah, thanks for coming. Really, thanks for coming. And thanks for sticking with us, even though we don't have video. Hopefully, you're getting the points that our presenters have for you. And you are filling out your comment cards, because this is really the best way for you to contribute to the Q&A that we're going to have in just a couple of minutes. After we have our last speaker, our last panelist come up here. Our last panelist is Greg Rock. He's an entrepreneur and climate activist He's also a board policy chair for Carbon Washington. He has a master's degree in sustainable energy engineering. He's an Audubon board member, and he's served as Carbon Washington's volunteer lobbyist in Olympia for the last 4 legislative sessions. Greg's climate activism focuses on getting Republican legislators and rural Washingtonians more engaged in and supportive of climate action. So we're really excited to have Greg come up here and talk to you all. He's used to talking without slides, so this is going to be perfect for him. All right, let's give it up for Greg.
I think I feel bad because I was kind of didn't want slides originally, and I guess I got my wish. I feel bad for the result. I am Greg with Carbon Washington. We are a grassroots organization. We advocate for climate action in Washington State, specifically around achieving a net zero greenhouse gas emission for the state. That is a goal that we can achieve. We're going to get there. This state is prepared to do it. We need to make sure we're doing it. The important part about net zero is that's not zero carbon emissions. Does everyone understand the difference between net zero and zero carbon emissions? The balance is what we call sequestration. And how many people know what sequestration is? That is impressive. A couple years ago, it would have been much, much smaller. And it reminds me of days like 15 years ago when you'd ask what climate change is, and about 7 people in the back of the room would know. This is growing. The whole thing is growing rapidly. Everyone here knows what climate change is. Everyone is soon going to know what sequestration is because it's a big solution set to the problem we're facing. So sequestration is getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, storing it in some form, hopefully on the planet for a long period of time. You can sequester carbon for a year, and like the apple that you might eat. We had a tree that absorbed carbon dioxide. It got stored in an apple. You ate that apple. You metabolized that apple, and you respirated the CO2 back out into the atmosphere. We are all polluters of CO2. It's okay. Because there's absorption. That's what's called biogenic carbon. It's caught up in a loop that's very short-cycled. The problem to global warming is the fossil fuel carbon dioxide emissions, where we're taking hundreds and millions of years of accumulated carbon dioxide and then releasing in the atmosphere in a very short period of time. But that does not mean that biogenic carbon flows can't be a solution set to the near-term problems we have today. We need to get to net zero carbon emissions at least by 2050, and every bit of carbon sequestration that we can deliver in farm, ranch, aquaculture settings, even if it's just an enhancement of a short-term biogenic cycle, can be a big contributor to our goal. Everybody on page with that? Can we do both? We can reduce emissions, number one, and we can also sequester carbon to achieve net zero carbon emissions. So the way that we're doing that, or trying to do that in Washington State, is with a bill called Senate Bill 5947. And we have these handouts. I'm not going to unfold it, but it'll walk you through the bill. Over there at the table, Carbon Washington, say hi to Noah and Megan afterwards. There's also engagement opportunity if you want to get involved in actually making this happen in Washington State. You can get involved. That's what grassroots organizations and grassroots participants in the democratic process do. They make the things they want to change in the world occur locally so they can happen nationally, so they can happen worldwide. So, Senate Bill 5947. One of the really unique natures of this bill is that it's bipartisan. It is a climate bill that has some of the biggest Republican names signed on supporting the bill. Senator Chesser is the head of the Republican Party in the Senate. He's a farmer in Ritzville, wheat farmer. He's one of the prime sponsors of this bill. Senator McCoy on the Democratic side, from the native tribe of Tulalip, is the prime sponsor of this bill. So we have a unique mixture of Democrats and Republicans coming together around a solution set that truly is a win-win. So if we reduce our carbon emissions, that's great. We know it comes with a lot of co-benefits, right? There's less local air pollution mainly. So that's a good co-benefit from reducing pollution. What's interesting with carbon sequestration is it also comes with a co-benefit. The more carbon we get out of the atmosphere and store in our soil, rather than the ocean where it causes acidification, the healthier our soil gets, as we just got explained very eloquently by someone who's been doing work on this for a very, very long time, so thank you, David. The more we get out of the atmosphere, the more we do to address climate change through carbon sequestration, the more resilient our land comes to climate sequestration. the more productive our land comes, the more economically fruitful our farms and ranches become. And I don't know if you're watching, but the economic situation in rural America right now is disastrous. Between trade wars, between poor yields, poor crop prices, there's an epidemic of farmer suicides in this country. And this is a real issue. We are undervaluing the environmental services that these parts of our rural community create. And so we want to get a bill out there that starts recognizing it. And so Senate Bill 5947 is a voluntary grant program. It allows farmers, ranchers, or aquaculturists to apply for grants on a competitive basis. And they can apply for grants in 3 categories, either reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, more efficient tractors, switching to biofuels rather than fossil fuels, host of different technology switches that can make your operation more efficiency, or switch to a cleaner source. There's also a second bucket around carbon sequestration in soil. So this is soil carbon farming, regenerative agriculture. You've heard a lot of the buzzwords, direct incentives for farmers that can get more carbon into their soil. And finally, there's a bucket around agroforestry. So this is planting trees in farm and ranch settings, especially important here in Washington along our riparian buffers, because it protects a lot of salmon habitat and the orca influence, of course, there. So that's the program. It's a voluntary grant program. It made good progress. It got out of the Senate last year. We got held up in the House, largely because the major commodity ag players felt the process was moving too quickly. And they were somewhat right. We dropped this bill very late in session. That it happened very fast. We are a small grassroots organization. We can't do stakeholdering in the hundreds of thousands of dollars category unless you guys start donating a lot of money. We are a 501c3 and C4, so whatever works for you. But the process was fast, and so now there was a $30,000 proviso that funded basically an interim stakeholder process. So we've been working with a lot of the major ag groups, trying to get them up to speed. Some of them are starting to move, I think, in positive directions. Others are dug in on peer resistance to the idea that we should act. And that's real. There are some people that just aren't there yet. But this is a policy that can reach across the aisle. It can find the people who are there, not just the legislators, but also the actual farmers and ranchers, and say, we want you to be part of this solution. And until we do that as Seattle, reach across the mountains and say, we want to work with you on this. We don't want to regulate what you're doing. We don't want to blame you. Guess what? Urban Seattle, we're the #1 polluter in this state. It's not rural America. It's us driving around in our cars, eating the food that they produce. So we need to have some real conversations about that and get involved. So I'm probably running a little over time. I'm not going to talk about some of the unique natures of this bill. We do some comparing of how do you compare emission offsets to sequestration credits. We've been doing a lot of really leading edge research around that question with some of the University of Washington professors. But I am going to say that this is really important that you act. It's not because you're one of 7.5 billion people in the world and you have a voice. That's true. It's not because you live in the United States, the economic powerhouse of the world with 350 million people. And your consumer choice clearly can change who the rest of the world's emulating. Everyone wants to be us and have our lifestyle right now, so we need to set the right example. But as you start thinking smaller, you live in Seattle, or you live in Washington State, only 7.5 million people here in Washington. Maybe you live in a legislative district like the 36th, right here in Seattle, 150,000 people, and you have two of the most important legislators on this issue in a state that is poised to make a big difference. So as I read that, people in these legislative districts in Washington State, the home of Boeing and Microsoft and all these companies that have changed the world, we have the economic resources here to change the world. We have political leaders that are trying to change the world. What they need is more support. And as I see it, you guys have more opportunity than 98% of the rest of the world to address this issue. You know, the struggling family in Somalia can't do much. You can. And one of the things you can do is get involved this legislative session, January and February. It's only 2 months out of your life. You can take a trip down there talk to your legislator, testify under public hearing when this and many other climate bills, like the low carbon fuel standard that's very important to this region, is coming up. And that's how we get this done. We got to keep working together. It's a long push. A lot of us have been doing this a long, long time. But we are making progress. Just the number of hands in here that know what sequestration is. I mean, I'm a sustainable energy engineer. I didn't know what sequestration was 5 years ago. So this is new stuff, and we're learning a lot, and we're making a lot of progress, but we need to do it together. So I look forward to all the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Greg. So at this point, I would love to get all of our panelists up front here, and they all have a microphone. They can take a seat right up front. We've got Greg, we've got Aaron, we've got David. And before we get started with the Q&A, I just want to remind you all that you have 3x5 cards at your table. Now, one thing I forgot to mention when you first came in is this event is sponsored by Cascadia Climate Action, which is an organization that, as the name implies, is all about action, right? First action for tonight is that you fill out your question card, okay? If you've done that already, please pass them to our volunteers who are circulating around. Hold your question high, and they'll come by and pick that up. You should also make sure that you check out CascadiaClimateAction.org. It's your one-stop shop for all things related to climate-related activities, events, and ways to get engaged. And the last thing you should definitely do before you leave tonight is see our many tablers who are around this venue. They have lots of great ways that you can get involved. As Greg has already mentioned, Audubon Washington has some really great ways for you to engage around the bill that's coming up before the Washington State Legislature. So there'll be more about that in just a little bit. Please go ahead and turn in your question card so we can get started with our Q&A. I've already got some of those going now. So let's go ahead and get started. So my first question, I think, is for Greg, because you mentioned that this was I know that you focused a lot on bipartisanship in the work that you do, and this was a bipartisan bill. Do you think, I mean, obviously there's some advantages to that. Do you see other avenues besides this bill where you're going to be able to get bipartisan support besides this bill?
Yeah, I think there's a number of categories that Republicans have expressed interest in, but more so they've expressed things they don't want to do. They don't want more regulation. They're not a big fan of pricing mechanisms unless it's done right. But I see a lot of interest in waste to energy. Conservatives understand very well that you shouldn't be wasting. And why would we waste energy? And anything that returns a good bottom line, it's all about the framing about what you're trying to do. And I find them more open to considering ideas than resistant to anything other than a couple of the big ones that we put in front of them, like cap and trade that's been there for 10 years now. And they've entrenched a position on it.
Great, thank you. So y'all, I forgot to mention also that we are recording this event. And so if you're having any trouble hearing, or you would actually like to see, I don't know, some slides, we will probably be able to do that in post-production. We'll probably add some cool special effects too, maybe some explosions or some laser lights. I don't know. We'll see. So next question is for Aaron. As a practitioner, you've heard about some of these interesting ways that we can sequester carbon. You talked about no-till or reduced till. We've talked about cover crops or fallow periods. Other folks have mentioned the idea of biochar or biosolids or other things. And I'm wondering, first of all, if you can talk at all about the issue of biochar, if you have any experience with that, because I know a couple of folks in the audience have asked questions about it. But then also, do you see situations in which some of these techniques are more or less suitable for large-scale commercial type operations?
Biochar first. I have not used it yet, but I am thinking about trying it this next year. Our fertilizer dealer has a lead on some pelletized biochar because we don't really have the resources to produce it ourselves to the scale that we would need for even our small 4 acres. Limitations of scale. Yeah, well, the work we did with WSU on the strip tillage, that could be adapted to a pretty large scale operation. I'm thinking like anything over 5 to 10 acres. But again, that research and development it's mostly cultivation technology. Weeds, in my view, are like the biggest hindrance to reduce or no-till. There's a lot of weeds out there, and they're more vigorous than our crops. Yeah, so it's the equipment at this point for a larger scale. Some of the smaller scale techniques that we're going to be using this next year with the shallow tillage, that's quite labor intensive at this point. There is quite a bit of research and development into machinery and techniques to scale it up a little bit, but anything beyond, I think, 10 acres of production would be prohibitively labor intensive unless customers want to start paying a lot more for their vegetables, which I think they should anyway, but the cost of that would have to be reflected in the price. But it really depends on the crop you're growing and the scale you're growing it at. And just quickly, too, about the tools, it's not only to do with the equipment technology, it has to do also, I think, with the genetic technology. And I'm not talking GMOs, I'm just talking, the crops we're working with, like I said, have been bred to not really have to compete with weeds. I think if we devoted some more energy to breeding crops that could compete with all these weeds we have, that's an integral part of the system. We can't only develop the machinery and technique side of it, we also need to develop the genetic side of it, the plant genetics. So put some pressure on the few public plant breeders that are out there still, because I think that's part of the equation that hasn't really been talked about yet.
That's really interesting. So, David, do you have anything else to add about the topic of biochar? I mean, from your research, have you come across that? Have you talked about that at all?
Yeah, there's a chapter on it in Growing Revolution. We have a little biochar stove that the Seattle Biochar group gave us years ago. I'm a pyromaniac. I love the thing. But it's, when you look at biochar, for those who may not have heard about it before, it's basically charcoal. And so the idea is that you've taken incompletely combusted organic matter, charcoal, and use it as a soil amendment. And there's studies that highlight how it can help mycorrhizal fungi grow. It can basically increase yields. It depends a lot on what it's made out of. So you want to make a lot of attention to how it's made, what temperature it got to, how it was made. It's kind of like your fruits and vegetables. You want to know who grew them and how they did it. Same with your biochar, because there's not just one way to do it. I had breakfast with a gentleman at a conference in Germany a couple years ago who had. He's one of the big sort of people in the biochar world who had been doing experiments with growing corn crops and trying to see, as you put more biochar into the soil that they were working with, what happened to their crop yield? He kept adding more biochar, and the yields kept going up to the point where he had 50% biochar in the mixture that had the highest yield. He was like, blew my mind. He didn't think that he thought once it got above 10% charcoal, it'd start going down. It can be a great medium for growing plants. I kind of view it as a habitat for beneficial microbes, for organisms. There's not a lot of food in biochar. It's mostly carbon. But it also can last a long time. I mean, the thing that geologists like me go out to look for when we're trying to date ancient civilizations and work with archaeologists is we look for charcoal in the soil because it can last thousands of years. So there's a real climate connection to biochar, but it can actually help boost fertility. But not all biochar is the same. You really have to know how it's made, how it's been done. And my favorite biochar story was one of my bands played once at an event that was like the biochar ball, where they had a complete rose that had been biocharred. It was like straight out of a Tim Burton movie.
All right.
And can I just pitch in there too?
Sure.
Having to do with this bill, Washington is such a big forestry producer, all that stuff that doesn't get milled into wood could make great biochar.
Is Carbon Washington pushing anything with biochar this session?
Well, as some people may know, we did advance a biochar memorial last session, which was successful. That passed out of both the Senate and the House. It just recognized that biochar is pretty darn interesting. Kind of in the same way we name a bridge. Biochar is interesting to Washington State now. And it's fun to see that a lot of the state agencies that received that memo are starting to do things. We saw a number of grants go out the door this year for biochar work that was associated with forestry projects. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to do something better with our forest fire risk management. We need to go into these forests and get thinning done. Some of them we may need to, do a more aggressive treatment that is large-scale harvest and restart and manage it properly from the start. But when we're going in and dealing with slash piles and deadfall, we can either go and wait for it to be dry or wet enough that we can just burn the pile with a bunch of diesel poured on it, which is current status quo, or we can start working with some of these mobile gasifiers, things like these air burners. They're just blowing a high-pressure air over the top of a dumpster, but it keeps all the pollution inside, and they're able to produce char while not having any of the local particulate exposure. It doesn't produce the best biochar, right? You want a thermal depolymerization unit that you can tune the residence time and the different temperatures, but it does produce decent char. And so there's a balance between, are you trying to clean metals, are you trying to just put it in some a planter to deal with runoff from the roads, because it can absorb a lot of the pollutants like a filter. It's just activated charcoal, essentially, or a carbon filter. So you can use it in that manner in lots of sense. So I think we need to start looking at ways to engage on our forestry more actively, and I think biochar can be a piece of that puzzle.
Okay, great, thank you. And by the way, this might be a little bit more aerobic, but next time I ask you to answer a question, if you could stand up, I think some of the folks in the back would benefit from being able to see us. So it might just be a little up and down, but that's probably good. It'll stretch our legs, right? So it seems like one of the places where the rubber is going to meet the road is how we're going to quantify how much carbon is in the soils and how we are going to create a system to measure that and compensate farmers as part of the bill. So I think some folks had questions about the scheme that's going to be used to actually measure the carbon and to verify that carbon.
Yeah, I think that's to me, so I'll stand up. So there's two elements to this question of measurement, what I call measurement, estimation, and verification. I think a lot of the acronyms don't include estimation, but almost all of them are doing some form of estimation as part of the process. So I think it's good to be transparent about that. There's two basically parts. One, we need to evaluate, can we measure how much change has occurred in the soil? Can we see that there is more carbon there than before? And the answer is yes, but not that well. We can see trends over time. We need to be very careful about the proximity to tillage, very careful about the time of year, the exact location. If you're doing soil organic matter testing, there's more complicated manners. I'd like to hear David maybe chime in on some of that. I am not a soil scientist. I'm an energy engineer, totally different sphere of work. But there's another part of it that I get engaged much more in, which is the metric development. If we know how much carbon is stored in the soil, and we know how long that carbon's been stored in the soil, how do we compare that to another potentially competing action? If I could take $50 and pay someone to not pollute, we call that an emission offset, that carbon dioxide is not going to go into the atmosphere, hopefully never. Now, it's hard to prevent fossil fuels from being burned in the future, and additionality is a very complicated thing that can never be fully evaluated. But in theory, let's say you can avoid that point of emission. How do you compare that to absorbing carbon dioxide and storing it on the earth for 5 years, or 10 years, or 100 years, or 1,000 years in biochar? And so that's the problem we've been doing a lot of work developing with some professors at University of Washington. And there are a couple of different approaches you can go. The one we've implemented in this bill is what is called a storage equivalency method. And we say that you will, through rule, the agency will establish a equivalency number of years. And so if you can store carbon for 100 years as it starts for the first 2 years, and that's the number we've come up with from all of our kind of evaluation, based on the kind of time scale we're looking at that's important. If you can store carbon for 100 years, we're saying that has an equivalent value to if you can avoid emitting 1 ton of emission today. And you can actually annualize it fairly well So if you can store carbon for 10 years, that has 1/10 the value of emitting 1 ton of carbon. So if I'm going to charge you $100 for your pollution, I should probably be willing to pay that no-till farmer $10 per ton $10 per every 10 years he stores carbon. And you can break it down to a ton year. So 1 ton year would be about 1/100th the value of emitting 1 ton of carbon. And so that's the way it's implemented in this rule, and it does get updated every 2 years as they compare the actual carbon reductions and continue developing the science.
And who would be responsible for verifying that?
The Washington State Conservation Commission is the agency in charge of the entire program and running the measurement and verification. They do consult with University of Washington and Washington State University as well as part of that process. And a lot of this ties into what's really a science called radiative forcing and global warming potentials, the same way you compare methane to CO2 over a specific period of time, a 20-year or 100-year timeline. We can look at the storage of carbon in the ground and the radiative forcing benefits over that same period of time. So you'll have kind of interaction between academia and agencies, specifically the Washington State Conservation Commission and also the Department of Agriculture involved.
Okay, cool. So, David, do you have any other thoughts on measuring carbon, since Greg brought that up?
If you're trying to measure carbon sort of everywhere, all over the landscape, it's really messy, will be really expensive, and it's not worth doing. And you can't do it from satellites, because if you're actually going to do the kind of farming that you want to do, where you keep the land covered, you can't see the ground through it. And so you'd have to use surrogates, which don't always work. My preferred way of actually looking at how to do it is to set up demonstration farms and run suites of practices that you can monitor how much they're actually changing carbon over time, because there's the seasonal variability, there's daily variability, there's annual variability. And so if you're measuring everything every year all the time, you're basically spending a lot of money to characterize the noise. And that's not a wise sampling strategy. You want to sample infrequently at long time intervals and detect the trends, but you want to compensate farmers on much shorter time scales. So I advocate basically trying to set up demonstration farms that are well documented, where you can kind of do the measure everything, and then set up regional protocols for the kinds of practice or how much you would pay farmers based on the expectation of what they'd be putting in, but then only validate that on the individual monitored farms on a fairly infrequent basis. And I don't have an idea of what infrequent is. I'm a geologist, so every 1,000 years or so. But there's the other way to think about carbon in the soil that I like to use as an analogy is, like, don't think that you're putting carbon in the soil and that carbon molecule has to stay there for 100 years. It's the wrong way to think about it. What you're wanting to do is you're wanting to basically raise the dam on the river that is the soil. In that sense, like, if you want to raise the storage capacity, the amount of water that's usable behind a dam in the river, you raise the dam, water flows in, fills it up the reservoir to a higher level, and then water keeps going out. And the reservoir level has been increased, even though the flux going in and out hasn't changed. We can look at soil in a similar way, where you think about, the amount of carbon you're storing in the soil. We want to raise the dam. You have carbon being emitted by the action of microorganisms in the soil, and you have carbon being produced by the plants and being fixed by microorganisms in the soil. What we want to do is keep more of that carbon on average in the soil at any one time, increase the storage amount. It's not, in my view, the arguments about long-lived carbon, stable carbon versus short-lived carbon is a complete sideshow to the real question, which is getting more carbon in the ground and keeping it there. If we change farming practices so that we raise the amount of carbon in the soil, we have to then keep those farming practices going to keep it going. And the really big challenge I see with all this is that if you basically engage in really good farming practices, rebuild your soil organic matter over the course of a few decades, somebody that wants to plow regularly and deeply can come and undo it all really fast. But that's not a technical problem. That's a social problem. That is a regulation and a sideboard and an ethos problem. If we can get across by the end of this century that it is simply wrong to degrade soil, then we may be able to get it to stick over the long run.
All right, that's great. So I want to, because we don't have very much time left, I want to get to some more controversial questions. You guys like controversy, right? So a couple of the questions that we've gotten from our audience have to do with beef, right? Beef is bad, right? That's why we keep hearing that beef is bad, but I don't think that
it's
you
delicious.
think beef is bad. So maybe David, you can start with this, and I would love to hear from the rest of the panelists as well about whether or not we really can produce beef in a way that actually is carbon neutral.
No, we can produce beef in a way that's carbon negative. I mean, it's not just that it could be carbon neutral. The question we ought to be asking about all our food, whether it's vegetables or whether it's grains or whether it's beef, is, well, there's the first question of what do we eat? I can get back to that. But what the first question we ought to be asking is, how is it grown? Because there are places in the world, particularly native grasslands, where a really good way to actually raise food for human consumption is through grazing, because cattle and livestock can convert cellulose that we can't digest into meat and milk that we can digest. In terms of their net carbon emissions and their net methane emissions, on the methane part, it depends totally on what they eat. And oddly, if they're grass-fed beef eating like a single species of grass, their methane emissions can be higher than in a CAFO. But if they eat a diverse diet that actually has a wider range of phytochemicals, chemicals that plants make, they can suppress the methanogen activity in the rumen and thereby suppress methane emissions. So it's really about how stuff's raised. It's not really very controversial that CAFO-raised beef is bad. That is true. It's bad for us, it's bad nutritionally, it's bad for the cows, it's bad for the climate. But the idea that we have to all go to a completely plant-based diet to solve the climate problem is simply not correct. In fact, if you look at the global dietary recommendations that just came out, the recommendations for the Western world is eat less meat, and for the developing world, eat more meat. What's missing from the discussion is how the meat is raised. And so my personal view, after sort of looking into the carbon budgeting for both plant-based diets and animal diets, is that in this country we ought to be eating far less better raised beef. But I think you can have a climate-conscious diet almost no matter what you eat if you pay attention to how it's raised.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm actually wondering, Aaron, from your own personal experience with grazing animals, I mean, have you seen any positive effects from pasturing animals on your farm?
Absolutely. Yeah, every year we have a fellow come teach a class with a projecting microscope, and we go out and take soil samples. Yeah, okay, is this loud enough? It's like in my mouth. Oh, sorry. That up, okay. Yeah, so we take soil samples of a range of different places in the field, and every year we take a sample from a plot that hasn't had animals grazed on it, and we take a sample from a plot that has. And the fungal community, the bacteria, everything is higher in those fields that have had animals grazed on it, like way higher. And so what we have been implementing on our farm is a long-term fallow period. So like a quarter of our production fields, 25%, will be fallow anywhere from 3 to 5 years, depending on how it goes. And we'll graze animals on that. Like some of it will be chickens, which eventually we'll be feeding with grain that we grew on farm. Sometimes it's sheep, sometimes it's pigs, depending on what kind of ecological functions we want them to perform based on the field we're going in. But yeah, the effect of grazing livestock on soil health and then like down the line vegetable health was astounding, really. Like it was way more drastic than I thought. So I recommend it.
Do you have something to add?
Yeah, I feel like I better stand up for beef as well. And it kind of feels like that sometimes in our community. Beef is being demonized. And you have to take a minute and put yourself in the rancher's shoes. In a society that is now demonizing the product, he might have been, a third-generation rancher. And this is the way it's been done. We didn't realize it was maybe causing a lot of problems. We also didn't realize the breadth of opportunity it creates. I mean, almost every sustainable rotational system has some sort of animal involved. There are tremendous opportunities. I would recommend you watch Alan Savory's TED Talk. He does a good job talking about how you reverse desertification. This is a climate resilient strategy. We need large herds of animals working highly degraded lands in an intensive grazing fashion. They poo all over it, and then they stomp that poo into the ground. That's how the Great Plains got to have such good carbon. It's because of the buffalo and the predators that were hunting those buffalo, keeping them tightly packed together. And so this is absolutely a solution set. And if we're going to demonize the product of a potential solution set, we might cut off one of the key solutions that we want in this fight for climate.
Okay, this is my last question. And then I think this is actually a pretty interesting one. So the Salk Institute proposes genetically changing food crops to draw down CO2 and store it in root material. And I've never heard of this exactly, but a natural polymer called suberin. Anybody have any thoughts about GMO crops as a way to sequester more carbon?
No, but I have thoughts about, we basically face a very fundamental choice in how we think about reshaping agriculture this century, which your question gets at. And that we can choose to basically choose the path of technology, which that represents, and we can choose the path of practices. So products that you can sell farmers, like a patented organism, I'm presuming they're not proposing to let it out for free, and practices that you can teach people that they can teach their neighbors and you can just do for yourself. What I wrote about in Growing a Revolution was the practices part of it. And while I may be a little agnostic on that particular proposal, I view it as completely unnecessary because we have other ways to farm that can meet the same goal simply by changing the way that we do it. And those ways are to prioritize the cultivation of the beneficial life in the soil that are responsible for the carbon sequestration, that are responsible for the nutrient cycling, that actually relies on building the life below ground. We don't have to genetically engineer it. There may be advantages to it, and maybe that's a great way to go for space travel, but we do have other ways forward that are systematically shortchanged when the conversation turns to technology because we all like the shiny new thing. Every reporter on the East Coast likes the technology angle because it's new and different and weird. I think the real opportunity lies in the mundane practices of reshaping the way farmers think about their land and how they treat their soil. That's where the huge opportunity lies that we're not tapping into.
Well said, well said. Well, actually, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and draw this Q&A to a close. I want to have a big round of applause for our panelists, please. So y'all, we got a little bit of a late start because of our technological issues, but I do want to encourage you all to stick around. There's plenty of opportunities to engage with our panelists. They're going to be sticking around as well, and we have some great tablers here. I just want to go ahead and give them a shout out once more and to have them raise their hands. We got Audubon Washington. Audubon Washington over there. Not only are they protecting birds and their habitat, but they're doing a lot in terms of community organizing around policies to reduce carbon emissions. We have Carbon Washington in the house over here. As Greg mentioned, they're doing some great things, and I think there's going to be an opportunity for some smaller roundtable discussions if you want to stick around for that with Greg and the folks from Carbon Washington. We have Seattle Neighborhood Farmers Markets. They're over there in the corner. Please go and talk to them. They are doing a lot to help farmers to produce local food and to use better growing practices. So go see them. We have Nori back there in the back. Nori, yeah. Nori believes the solution to climate change is really straightforward. It's all about removing CO2. And so Nori is turning a complex and frustrating process of removing CO2 into something that's simple and scalable. Nori makes it incredibly easy to pay farmers for verifiably removing and storing carbon in their soil. So go and talk to them about that. We have Tilth Alliance. Tilth Alliance is over here. They are working in community with farmers, gardeners, and eaters to build sustainable, healthy, and equitable food future. So please go and see them about that. And last but not least, we have Cascadia Climate Action over there in that corner. Please go and talk to them. They have some great ways for you to engage before you leave tonight. As I said, really would like everybody to do one thing to help protect and restore our climate before you leave tonight. So please just make that promise to yourselves before you leave. Otherwise, I want to thank you all for bearing with us and enjoy the rest of your evening. Stick around. There's lots more with these fine folks. So thank you very much.
And if you want to learn more and pick up a book, come see me in the next few minutes in the corner.
Go see David in the corner. All right. And go see Greg in that corner. And Aaron will just hang out up here. Thank you very much, everybody.